Welcome. This is the first in the series of videos on Robbins Socio-Rhetorical criticism. We're going to look at the intertexture. Robbins' socio-rhetorical world looks at the text in a unique way. It looks at the implied author. It looks at the implied reader. It looks at the represent world, and it looks at the verbal signs, the language. Inside of that, it looks at the intertexture, that is, what are the specific things that are happening in the text. It then looks at the intertexture, what historical context, what cultural context. It then looks at the narrator and character that forms the link between that, and the social and cultural texture and the ideological texture. That places the text within its implied world, an implied author, an implied reader, a world, and then beyond that, in the Mediterranean world, there might be the real author, information, and language. So interpretation and theology from that goes beyond that world. The textures, again, that you saw in that diagram are the intertexture, that is the texture of the text, the intertexture, the cultural, historical background, then a social and cultural texture, an ideological texture, and out of all of social, Robbins Socio-Rhetorical in different places, how theology and ideology work together into our Greek exegesis. Well, let's look at Robbins' inner texture. It has a repetitive progressive texture, an open, middle, and closing texture, narrational texture, argumentative texture, and sensory aesthetic texture. Now, many of these are Lad's observations or Bauer and Trainer's observations of word, literary terms, grammar, and logical terms. So let's look at the repetitive progressive texture. He looks for repetitive word patterns that are repeating or highly similar. Some of you have been told that if it's not exact, it's continuing. And that's what he means, is it's a continuing pattern of words. He looks for repetitive character or narrative agents. He looks at repetitive topics or ideas. He asks, what patterns are emerging? Is the repetition exact, or does it vary slightly? If it varies slightly, is there a pattern to the progression? Does the progression bring some words together besides the pattern? Well, let's look at a particular narrative progression. Luke 6:37 says, do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Pardon, and you will be pardoned. Give, and it will be given to you. They will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken over together, and running over. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. Now notice you have repetition of the verb judge, condemn, pardon, give, measure, and measured, both in the present tense and will be future tense. So in this you see the progression. You also see a progression of do not, you will not be. Do not, you will not be in English. You will find some of that comes from the Greek verb tenses. Now, what about open, middle, and closing? Most narratives have an open, a middle, and a closing. In Mark, you see John crying in the wilderness and Jesus' baptism. Then in the middle, you have Jesus' ministry, death, and resurrection. At the end, you have women at the empty tomb and Jesus appearing in his resurrected body to the women and disciples. It is a middle, ending, and closing. Now, within the story, there are many middle and endings and closings. There's the opening of John's ministry, the middle of his ministry, Jesus' baptism, and the closing with John's death. Narration, the texture, asks who are the main characters, what is the plot and the ending, who narrates the information, what is the real author, who is the implied author, who is the listener, who is the implied listener. what's happening, who, what, when, where, why in this story. The argumentative text is something you may be familiar with in our work on working in inductive Bible study or deductions. Deductions are premise and conclusion. Deductive comes from a main conclusion to a specific information. Inductive comes from facts to a main conclusions. Now, there are a couple other interesting places. The Sharia, a speech attributed to someone else that becomes a lesson, is key because Jesus' speeches become a lesson in the gospel. And the enthymeme is a supporting reasoning with, if I do this, then Y will happen, where X and Y are really probable in today's world, instead of the sort of logical, deductive, or inductive conditional reasoning where it might not be possible at all. And you have a prosopopia, interesting word I have trouble speaking, but in Greek it was writing in such a way that one creates a character and it plays a decisive role. You can ask yourself if the gospel writers are doing that. Now, lastly, we come to the sensory aesthetic texture. Words create a sensory picture. Now, let's look at a passage from Matthew. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming for baptism, he said to you, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come." You picture vipers feeling fire, fleeing a fire and fleeing it, you know, and that contrasts with the normal respectful attitude toward the Pharisees and Sadducees as rulers. Pictures, this picture has pictures within it that are in the mind's eye and colliding emotions. Look for the same sort of thing in your text. Well, next we'll come to Robbins Intertexture with an oral scribal intertexture, cultural intertexture, social intertexture, and historical intertexture. Thank you for listening to this, and we shall begin again with Robbins Intertexture.